Hollow Creek was the kind of town where secrets festered beneath polite smiles and nods on Main Street. It nestled in the Appalachian foothills, a place where time moved slower and outsiders rarely lingered. Richard Grayson, a 61-year-old widower, was one of the town's most enduring enigmas. His small cottage sat on the edge of Lake Hollow, its weathered exterior a reflection of the man inside. Richard once had a life filled with purpose. He had been a beloved history teacher, a husband, a man respected in the community. But that was before the accident. Before his wife, Claire, died on a rain-slick road one October evening, leaving him with nothing but memories and a crushing sense of guilt. Now, Richard spent his days restoring antiques in his cluttered workshop, each creak of the old wood beneath his feet echoing the solitude of his existence. The world had moved on, but Richard remained tethered to his past, like the crumbling furniture he painstakingly brought back to life. That was until she walked in. It was a Thursday afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the lake. Richard stood behind the counter of Hollow Creek Antiques, inspecting the cracked frame of an ornate mirror, when the bell above the door jingled softly. "Hi there," a voice chimed. He looked up, and for a moment the room seemed to brighten. She couldn't have been more than 18, tall, with long auburn hair that shimmered like autumn leaves. Her eyes were a startling green, filled with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something darker. "Hello," Richard replied, setting the mirror down carefully. "Can I help you?" "I'm just looking around," she said, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of a porcelain vase. "This place is interesting." Richard nodded. "It's been here a long time. Longer than me." Hi. She smiled, and he noticed the faintest hint of a bruise on her wrist, barely concealed beneath the sleeve of her jacket. "I'm Lila," she said. "Lila Bennett." "Richard Grayson," he replied. "Nice to meet you, Lila." Lila lingered, asking questions about the pieces in the shop, where they came from, how old they were, what stories they carried. Richard, unaccustomed to visitors, found himself answering more than just her questions. He talked about his work, about the history of Hollow Creek, about the importance of preserving the past. "You must love this town," Lila said softly. Richard hesitated. "I did, once." She looked at him, her green eyes searching. "What happened?" "Life," he said simply, and she didn't press further. That evening, as Richard watched Lila disappear down the dusty road, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. A spark of connection, however fleeting. But Hollow Creek was a town of whispers, and whispers had a way of turning into storms. Question for viewers. Do you think Richard is aware of the danger Lila might bring into his life, or is he blinded by his loneliness? The next day, Lila returned. This time she brought a notebook and asked if Richard could teach her about restoring antiques. "I want to learn," she said. "I think it's amazing how you can bring something old back to life." Richard hesitated. He had spent years avoiding attachments, avoiding the pain that came with losing them. But there was something about Lila, something that made him feel needed again. "All right," he agreed. "I'll teach you." Their lessons began in the dimly lit workshop behind the store. Richard showed her how to sand down rough edges, how to apply varnish with careful precision, how to recognize the value hidden beneath years of neglect. Lila was a quick learner, but she was also a talker. As they worked, she shared bits and pieces of her life. A mother who had left when she was young, a father who died in a factory accident, and a stepfather, Dean Abbott, who she described in clipped, bitter tones. "He's not a good man," Lila said one evening, her voice low. "He's controlling and mean." Richard frowned but said nothing. It wasn't his place to intervene in the affairs of others. Yet the bruise on her wrist lingered in his mind, a silent testament to her words. As weeks passed, Lila's visits became more frequent. The townsfolk noticed. Hollow Creek was small, and it didn't take long for whispers to circulate. "Did you see her? That Bennett girl hanging around with old Grayson." They murmured in the diner, at the post office, outside the church. "Strange, isn't it? He's old enough to be her grandfather." Sheriff Mark Preston heard the whispers too, a stocky man with a keen eye and a protective streak for the town. Mark had known Richard for years. He decided to pay his old friend a visit. "Richard," Mark greeted him one morning at the shop. "Can we talk?" Richard nodded, gesturing to a chair by the window. "What's on your mind, Mark?" Mark took a seat, his eyes scanning the room. "It's about Lila Bennett. People are talking, wondering what a young girl like that is doing spending so much time with an old man like you." Richard stiffened. "I'm teaching her, that's all." "I believe you," Mark said. "But not everyone will. You know how this town is. They'll think the worst." "I'm not doing anything wrong," Richard insisted. "I know," Mark said again, his voice gentle. "But sometimes perception is reality." "Be careful, Richard. For your sake and hers." Question for viewers. Do you think Sheriff Preston is right to be concerned, or is he overstepping his bounds? Lila arrived the next evening, her presence lighting up the dim workshop. She brought a plate of cookies from Martha's diner, and a mischievous smile that made Richard momentarily forget the sheriff's warning. "They're peanut butter," she said, setting the plate down on the cluttered table. "Thought you might like a treat," Richard chuckled softly. "I can't remember the last time someone baked for me." "I didn't bake them," Lila admitted with a grin. "Martha did, but it's the thought that counts, right?" As they worked, the air between them grew warmer, more familiar. Lila sanded down an old oak chair, humming a tune Richard couldn't quite place. "Do you ever think about leaving Hollow Creek?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Richard paused, his hands resting on a worn chisel. "I used to. After my wife passed, I thought about it every day, but this is where she's buried. It's hard to leave a place that holds so many memories." Lila nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I want to leave this town. It's like a cage. Everyone knows everything, or at least they think they do." Richard noticed the flicker of sadness in her eyes. "Where would you go?" "Anywhere," she said with a sigh. "Somewhere no one knows me. Somewhere I can start over." Richard wanted to tell her that running didn't always solve things, but he held back. Maybe, for someone like Lila, it could. That night, after Lila had gone, Richard stood by the window, watching the moonlight ripple across the surface of Lake Hollow. He thought about Lila's words, about cages, and starting over. For the first time in years, he wondered if it was possible for him, too. Question for viewers. Do you believe Richard is starting to see Lila as a second chance at life, or is he simply caught in her charm? The whispers in Hollow Creek grew louder. At first they were contained to the diner and the church steps, but soon they seeped into every corner of the town. Did you hear? Richard Grayson and Lila Bennett were seen walking by the lake together. He's old enough to be her grandfather. What could they possibly be doing? I heard she spends the night at his place sometimes. Lila seemed unfazed by the rumors. If anything, she leaned into the attention, smiling knowingly when townsfolk glanced her way. Richard, on the other hand, felt the weight of their stares. One evening, as they worked on a particularly delicate armoire, Richard finally broached the subject. "Lila," he said carefully, "people are talking about us, with amusement. Let them talk. Who cares what they think?" "I care," Richard admitted. "This town, It doesn't take kindly to things it doesn't understand. Lila set down her brush and crossed the room to him. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. "I'm not afraid of them, Richard. Are you?" Her question lingered in the air, heavy with challenge. Richard searched her face for a moment, seeing a determination that both inspired and unnerved him. "No," he said finally. "I'm not afraid." But he was lying. That night, Richard dreamed of Claire. She stood at the edge of the lake, her long hair blowing in the wind, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Richard," she whispered. Her voice carried on the breeze. "Be careful." He woke with a start, the memory of her voice echoing in his mind. Question for viewers: do you think Richard's dreams of Claire are a warning, or are they just the product of his guilt? The following week, Lila arrived at Richard's cottage with a fresh bruise on her cheek. Her usual bright demeanor was dimmed, replaced by a simmering anger. "What happened?" Richard asked, his voice tight with concern. "Dean," she said flatly. "He's been drinking again. Things got out of hand." Richard's hands clenched into fists. He had never been Dean Abbott, and he had heard enough from Lila to know the man was no good. "Did you call the sheriff?" he asked. Lila shook her head. "What's the point? Sheriff Preston won't do anything. Dean's been in this town forever. People look the other way." Richard wanted to argue, but deep down he knew she was right. Hollow Creek had a way of protecting its own, even when it shouldn't. "I can't stay there anymore," Lila said, her voice trembling. "I need to get out." Richard's heart ached at her vulnerability. "You can stay here," he offered, "just until you figure something out." Lila's eyes softened. "Thank you, Richard. I don't know what I'd do without you." Ugh. They gathered her belongings quickly, stuffing clothes and personal items into a duffel bag, but as they made their way back to the front door, a voice slurred from the darkness. "Lila!" Dean stumbled into view, his eyes bloodshot and filled with anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" "I'm leaving," Lila said, her voice steady. Dean's gaze shifted to Richard. "And who the hell is this?" "Your boyfriend." He laughed, a cruel, guttural sound. "You think you can just leave?" Dean lunged forward, grabbing Lila by the arm. "You're not going anywhere." "Let her go," Richard said, his voice shaking but resolute. Dean sneered. "Or what, you gonna stop me, old man?" Richard's hands trembled, but he stood his ground. "I said let her go." Dean shoved Lila aside and stepped toward Richard. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." The room spun in slow motion. Richard reached for a heavy candlestick on the nearby table as Dean swung a fist. The impact sent Richard reeling, but adrenaline surged through him. In one swift motion, Richard swung the candlestick. It connected with a sickening thud against Dean's temple. Dean staggered, his eyes wide with shock before collapsing to the floor. Silence filled the room. Lila knelt beside Dean, pressing her fingers to his neck. She looked up at Richard, her face pale. He's dead." Panic set in. Richard stared at Dean's lifeless body, his mind racing. "We need to call the sheriff," he said, his voice shaking. "No one will believe it was self-defense." Richard's breath came in ragged gasps. "But what do we do?" Lila's eyes were cold, calculating. "We get rid of him." Under the cover of darkness, they dragged Dean's body to the nearby woods. The trees loomed like silent witnesses as they dug a shallow grave. As they covered the body with dirt, Richard's hands shook uncontrollably. He had crossed a line he never thought he would. Lila stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "It's over now," she said quietly. "We're free." Days turned into weeks, and Dean's disappearance became the talk of Hollow Creek. Sheriff Preston led the search, but no trace of Dean was found. Richard tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but the weight of his actions pressed down on him. He saw Dean's face in every shadow, heard his voice in every whisper. One evening, Sheriff Preston visited the shop. "Richard," he said, his eyes filled with concern. "Have you seen Lila?" Richard's heart skipped a beat. "No. Why?" "She's missing," Preston said. "No one's seen her since yesterday." That night, Richard received a letter slipped under his door. It was from Lila. "Richard, I have to leave. The town was getting too dangerous for me. Thank you for everything." "I'll never forget you." Leela, Richard sank into a chair, the letter trembling in his hands. She was gone, but as he stared at the letter, something didn't sit right. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, not rushed. It was as if she had planned her departure. Then he noticed the postscript. "Sometimes the only way to be free is to disappear." Richard's blood ran cold. He remembered her words about Dean, the calculated way she had orchestrated everything. Had she used him all along, the realization hit him like a thunderclap. Lila hadn't been a victim. She had been a mastermind. Months later, the townsfolk still whispered about Dean's disappearance and Lila's sudden departure. One rainy evening, Richard received a postcard from a city far away. The image showed a bustling street, and the message on the back read, "Hello, Richard. Hope you're well. Life here is freeing. Love, Lila." Richard stared at the postcard, a chill running down his spine. She was alive, thriving in a new life. And he was left in Hollow Creek, haunted by the ghosts of their secrets. Final question for viewers. Was Lila a victim of her circumstances, or was she a manipulative mastermind from the start? I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe and put on notifications for more.